the beauties of science. I think these are things that are infinitely more awe-inspiring and wonderful and majestic than any invocations of the burning bush or the immoral doctrine of vicarious redemption, whereby a single human is made the scapegoat for all sins, and we absolve ourselves not just of sin but of our responsibility by throwing our sins on him. A disgusting idea, fortunately, never happened. They thought he was a sorcerer and a fraud and an imposter.
Now, are you willing to accept the view of Peter Singer that man has no ultimate dignity, meaning, hope, or value? If not, why not?
No, but then the why not is problematic, of course, because there is, whether you are a materialist or a supernaturalist, no particular reason to say that human life has any enormous innate value. After all, religion disposes of people in heaps and mounds and says, go out, we depart into eternal fire, you're dust, you're nothing. If you don't have our faith, you're nothing less than nothing, you're worse, or evil, wicked, so forth. So it's not as if by assuming a God, you suddenly find that life is all worthwhile after all. If it was that simple, we wouldn't have to be having this discussion. I think this, essentially, I ask myself, why do I care? Why do I care not just about myself and my children, but why do I think I often care in general? Well, if I didn't, I wouldn't belong to a species that would have got this far. It may sound a platitudinous answer, but I think there's some force to it. If we didn't have human solidarity, if we didn't realize that we are brothers and sisters one with another, that we have responsibilities, duties to one another, that these are not merely reciprocal in evolutionary terms, in other words, you be nice to me, I'll look out for you, but that they can involve real ties, real bonds of affection, friendship, even love. If we didn't know that we were able to think like that, and we exempt the quite large minority of humans who are born without this, the sociopaths and psychopaths, who I suppose we have to concede are also made in God's image, if you accept that tautology, it leaves nothing really unexplained. That would tell us why we had warm feelings for one another, and also explain why we were here instead of having joined the species that went, all the other ones that went out of business, under the same divine supervision, I might add, including humanoid species like the Cro-Magnons and the Neanderthals, who it's quite clear buried each other with care and with love, looked out for one another, and so forth and so on, but somehow didn't make some divine grade. Do you see where I'm going with this? I do hope so.
Okay, John?
Well, Peter Singer, what he thinks is extremely disturbing. I agree actually very much with Christopher that we find ourselves with these feelings and morality within us. I don't think that's the issue, because my Christian faith guarantees those to Christopher Hitchens as it does to me. The problem is the rational justification of this against the view of someone like Singer, who is taking his extrapolations from evolution to a logical conclusion and ending up with views that a newborn baby is of no more value than a dog, a chimp, or a pig. In other words, devaluing human beings. And that seems to me to be a very serious direction in which society is going. If you teach people that they're no different from animals, it may just be they'll start to behave like animals. So what prevents me from going down that line is that I deny completely his premise. And his premise is there's nothing unique about human beings. I want to say there's something absolutely unique about them. They are, of course, animals, but they're more than that. They're created in the image of God, and that gives them infinite value and dignity. And we will jettison that at our peril. And I think it's being jettisoned in the name of a very seriously flawed philosophy, which is, as Nietzsche predicted, exactly what will happen if you attempt to live out atheism to its consequences. It'll end up in madness.
I think it's actually Chesterton says somewhere that where animals are worshipped, humans tend to be sacrificed. If you look at ancient cultures, and some not so ancient, that would tend to be true. I remember when if it wasn't Singer, it was one of his disciples, said that his own baby daughter was no more to him than would be, say, a rat or a flea or, well, let's leave it at that. I remember thinking, my first thought was, I'm glad I'm not his daughter. But my second thought is, I'm glad I'm not his pet rat either.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it seems he doesn't have a great deal of sort of love to spare for anyone or anything. Look, animal rights can be overdone, and certainly have been, by especially people who object to medical experiments in a hysterical manner. But we have learned a great deal in the recent past about our kinship with and commonalities with other creatures. And we've discovered amazing things about the capacity, including the capacity for family life, solidarity, society building, and so on, among pigs, monkeys, dolphins, and others. And we know, because of the genome program, of our kinship with other much less advanced creatures, and that we are only ourselves half a chromosome away from being chimpanzees. The one thing this is impossible to square with is the idea of us being made in the image of God. That's clearly over.
It clearly isn't.
Anthropomorphically, animalistically, whichever way you slice it, we are primates. So in that case, in the image of what God are the others made? It gets you nowhere. It's a strictly meaningless statement.
Yeah. It's interesting,
Has
Christopher.
no value.
My geneticist friends in Oxford, when the similarity between the chromosomes and so on, the DNA of animals with humans, was discovered, they said, well, we always told you so. It shows that it doesn't lie in the chromosomes. There's a lot bigger story to be told, I think, and it would be very premature to close the discussion on that basis. Stephen Jay Gould, was it he, who said that we're not 98% chimpanzee, we're 100% human.
Compatible statement.
Religions claim humans have dignity, but then divide people into saved and condemned. In Matthew 25:46, it says, "Some go to eternal life, and others to eternal punishment." That means your value depends on belief, not on being human. And history backs this up. Religious systems have justified wars, persecution, and exclusion. People labeled as heretics, unbelievers, or sinners. That's not a system that naturally protects human dignity. Hitchens' point is simpler and grounded in reality. Humans care about each other because we evolved as social beings. Empathy, cooperation, even love. These are traits that helped us survive. You don't need anything supernatural to explain that. Even science shows we're closely related to other animals, sharing about 98 to 99% of our DNA with chimpanzees. That connects us to life on Earth, not to some special divine category. So when religion claims it's the source of morality or value, the evidence just doesn't support that. Human value comes from being human, from our ability to care, think, and connect, not from belief in a system that divides people in the first place.
This next question does address some of the issues brought up in the last exchange. 63% of Americans do not accept evolution, and that percentage may even be higher in the audience for this evening. The question for you, John, would be, what are the long-term consequences of this kind of mistrust of science?
Well, I think, first of all, this could be a discussion for an entire debate, actually.
How about 6 minutes?
I would want to know, first of all, what you mean by evolution. If you mean simply what Darwin observed, that is the fact that natural selection produces variation and so on, then that's not a particularly controversial thing. We can observe it. If you mean by evolution, the notion that by unguided, mindless processes, life originally arose and comes to be what it is, I myself as a scientist find that unconvincing. And I find it unconvincing as a mathematician particularly because at the heart of life there is the database of DNA. And when we notice anything with a semiotic nature, language that is, language like 3.5 billion letters in exactly the right order, we immediately make an inference upwards, not downwards, to say that by whatever the mechanisms involved of getting this, it bears the telltale mark of an intelligence standing beside it. So it seems to me that there's a very healthy scientific debate to be had about the reach of evolution. And so we need to define our terms very carefully. But not being an American, I can't really predict what's going on in here. The fact that people are suspicious seems to me to show that there's a real debate to be had. And all the evidence is certainly not, in my opinion, on one side.
The figures on American belief in things like virgin birth and the devil and their doubt of things like, are, in my opinion, wildly exaggerated and padded and produced by leading questions asked of the sort of people who happen to be in their kitchens all day and who've nothing else to do. And what they tend to show, mainly when you interrogate them, is they don't even know what it is they don't believe in. I would instance Governor Michael Huckabee, for example, who says, of course he doesn't believe that he's descended from apes. Well, the theory of evolution is not that Governor Huckabee is descended from apes. He may know something about his family tree that I've also suspected in my time, but it wouldn't invalidate the general proposition. Usually the people who don't know about Darwinism are the ones who say they don't believe in it, which isn't a fair test of anything. I'll just add on this point of not being descended from, but having things in common with our primate cousins. We do, as Darwin says, bear the unmistakable stamp of our lowly origin. We do grow a coat of hair when we're in the womb and then shed it in the womb at about 3.5 months. We do have vestigial tails. We do have appendices that are for the breaking down of stuff on the savannah that we no longer need to eat. And we do have wisdom teeth and other dentition that we don't any longer require because we were adapted to an environment a savannah environment that we've long ago abandoned. So saying that you're 100% human is only another way of saying that you're very much 98% primate. Voila. Otherwise it's a distinction without a difference.
I think I'll ask this question. This is addressed to Christopher, but again, for both of you to address. And I believe one of your early books, Letters to a Young Contrarian. So this may be an interesting answer for you to give. What advice do you have for someone who has left theism, but was raised in an institution like Samford or in a church and is still in that institution? What advice would you give that person?
You'll feel so much better if you leave it behind you and go and study literature instead, and the consolations of philosophy and the beauties of science. I think these are things that are infinitely more awe-inspiring and wonderful and majestic than any invocations of the burning bush or the immoral doctrine of vicarious redemption, whereby a single human is made the scapegoat for all sins, and we absolve ourselves not just of sin, but of our responsibility by throwing our sins on him. A disgusting idea, fortunately, never happened. The cultural question that remains, I think, is this: how are people going to live when they've given up the supernatural and the superstitious? Are we still going to need, I would say we are still going to need, the numinous and the transcendent? That's innate in us too, as is reason, as is morality. And so the great struggle is going to be how we find consolation and beauty and reflection when we have come to terms with the fact that we don't have a divine dictator to solve our problems for us, and that the heavens are empty, and that our prayers are not answered, and that we're alone with one another and have to make the best of it. I submit that that's going to be the great problem for civilization from now on. And a lot of energy, moral as well as aesthetic, is going to have to be put into solving it. But the beginning of wisdom is to realize you must emancipate yourself from the idea that you are the plaything of a supernatural boss. Fortunately, that's not true.
John.
Instead of dealing with evidence, it shifts into vague ideas like meaning, purpose, or design. But none of that actually proves anything. Saying DNA looks designed doesn't make it designed. That's just an assumption. Hitchens cuts through that and goes straight to the deeper issue. Religion doesn't just make claims about the world. It builds a system where people are told to accept those claims without proof. And look at the core idea he points out. Christianity teaches that someone else takes the punishment for your actions. That's not morality. That's outsourcing responsibility. Even the Bible supports that idea. In 2 Corinthians 5:21, it says one person is made to take on sin for others.
Well, I don't live in America, but I would be very sad to think that in any university, a person that changed their worldview in either direction would no longer feel comfortable, because I work at a university where there are all kinds of worldviews, and that, to my mind, is the wonderful thing about being there. So I would very much hope a person could still find a lot of room and space. That's why universities are so important, that people are free to make these decisions and discuss them. So, as to, you would agree with that, Christopher?
Very much so, yes.
Yes, exactly. I'm delighted, by the way, that Christopher admitted that in that answer that he believes in the transcendent. That might lead me to ask the question where it comes from, but perhaps for another time.
No, it's a perfectly good question. It comes from, there's a fusion, I think. I can only speak for myself, because I think that, as James says in the varieties of religious experience, you may not doubt that people have them, or you shouldn't at any rate, you should grant that they do. You can't make them applicable objectively. They're subjective to the person concerned, but I would say it's roughly where the erotic meets love, meets landscape, meets music and poetry. And it's a junction a lot of people, I hope, will be familiar with. If not, I recommend that you try it, and then try it again, even more intensely. For example, I wrote a book once about a famous building called the Parthenon, without which I could not be, without which our civilization couldn't be. Pre-Christian, by the way, as is a huge amount of the civilization that Habermas claims to be inspired by it. That to one side. The symmetry and the beauty and the frozen music and poetry of the Parthenon and of the Greek style is an indispensable thing. If it were to be destroyed, I would feel sort of orphaned. But I have no interest in the religion that used to animate it. The cult of Pallas Athena is dead and void to me. So is the idea of Athenian imperialism. So are the so-called mysteries of Eleusis and the rest of it. All that's left for me are the schools of philosophy that are worth studying. So again, it's going to be a question: how do we assimilate what was to previous generations and previous religions and extinct faiths something so important? How do we keep the value that is innate in that without surrendering to the cults and illusions that so much animated it? These are very important cultural issues.
Okay.
And I submit that we can do it.
Okay. John, I'll give you the last response on this, and then we'll move to our closing remarks.
Well, just briefly, I just find it a bit difficult to see how a mindless, unguided process produces aesthetics and all these transcendent experiences.
Humans create meaning. We respond to patterns, symmetry, sound, stories. That's how our brains work. You don't need a supernatural explanation for that. And religion has a habit of taking normal human experiences and claiming ownership over them. You feel something powerful, and suddenly it's called divine. But those same experiences exist everywhere, across different cultures and even outside religion completely. Even the Bible admits people can be moved emotionally without truth. In Jeremiah 17:9, it says the heart is deceitful. So even Scripture recognizes that feelings can mislead.
Why, in the words of one of our guests here, why is one myth or folk tale more true than another?
Well, first of all, I don't think they're all myths. I think there are many myths around in the world. And certainly the question is an important question, because it makes the distinction between the kind of deism or even theism that responds to the design in the universe and so on, and says, why this one God? My answer to that, ladies and gentlemen, is very simple. I have to decide that, like I decide everything else, on the basis of the evidence. And the evidence in the case of the life, death, resurrection of Jesus Christ has convinced me that he is God incarnate. So I base my faith on that evidence. And of course, each one of us must make up our own mind. Now, if we had time, I could explain that evidence in detail. But the point of the question is, how can we decide? We have to decide on the basis of evidence. Just as people who take the atheist view, they think the evidence points that way. And mercifully, we're still a free enough society that we can make these decisions. But we must make them personally.
Okay. Christopher, would you like to respond to that?
Well, you'll have noticed that there are many moments in the New Testament Gospels. One of them I'll take for a simple reason that it's easy to remember, that the Messiah will come to Jerusalem riding an ass or a donkey. But there are many others, including what town he'll be born in and so forth, where it says in the text, and this was done so that the prophecy should be fulfilled, that it should be done, because they knew what the prophecies were. A virgin will conceive, for example, is another one, though the word in Hebrew, alma, actually just means marriageable young woman, doesn't mean unpenetrated young female at all. But it's all reverse engineering. It says right there in the text, we're telling you this happened because that would mean that the prophecies had come true. So I think you might suspect a little, mightn't you, someone who's telling you literally as they're going along why they're telling you this so that the conditions of prophecy fulfillment can be met. But there's a much graver problem even than that naivete, which is that these prophecies are of a Jewish Messiah to come. And the Jewish religious authorities of the time considered, and who were the nearest, much closer to being eyewitnesses, if the story is true at all, much closer than the authors of any of the Gospels. They were the people who were the religious authority in the area. He was a member, if he existed, of their congregation. They thought he was a sorcerer and a fraud and an impostor, and convicted him of blasphemy, because though he in fact never said that he was God, there are some Christians I know who do say that Jesus is God. There are some who say he only claimed to be the son of. The critical question is, he's asked, art thou the Christ? Are you the Messiah? And he gives a slightly evasive answer at this point, but it's enough to make the Sanhedrin rend its garments. So all you're seeing in this tale, if it be true at all, if it have any truth to it, is the origin of Jewish-Christian fratricide. Of the Jews who have nurtured the idea of prophecy and the Messiah through their prophets for generations, who believe the Messiah has not yet even considered deigning showing up, and those who tell the Jews, why are you wasting your time? The good news has already happened. Why don't you just get with the program? I submit that neither of these propositions is worthy of the consideration of an intelligent or educated human being. It's Bronze Age peasant Palestinian superstition. And the competition over it and interpretations over it have made humanity's life even more miserable than it was going to be otherwise.
Okay. Well, I know that Dr. Lennox has a response to that.
And in the third form of plagiarism that it takes, which is the plagiarism of Islam from both Judaism and Christianity, the competition between monotheism has become really outright menacing. And the real responsibility of citizens is to hold it down, is to resist theocratic bullying and the superstitions that underlie it.
When Lennox says he believes Christianity because of evidence, that sounds strong. But once you look closer, it falls apart. The Gospels literally show signs of storytelling shaped to fit prophecy. They say things like, "This happened so the prophecy would be fulfilled." That's not independent evidence. That's writing a story to match an expectation. Take the virgin birth. The word in Hebrew, alma, just means a young woman, not a virgin. That's a mistranslation that got turned into doctrine. And here's the bigger issue. If Jesus really fulfilled Jewish prophecy, why didn't the people who knew those prophecies best accept him? The Jewish authorities at the time rejected him and called him a fraud. So now you've got competing religious claims, all saying they're true, all built on old texts and interpretations. So let me ask you this. Do you think religion actually has real evidence behind it? Or is it just stories and interpretations that people keep defending? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear where you stand. If you found this helpful, make sure to like and subscribe so you don't miss the next breakdown. And this is part 2 of the debate, so if you want the full context and deeper arguments, go watch the full conversation.